Hello and welcome everybody to this episode of Sustainability Street. My name is Becky Toll, owner-manager of Crowbury Consulting Limited, and today's episode is going to be focusing on the value of certification services for sustainability. I'd like to welcome our special guest, Curtis Thornton, Sales Executive from SGS, to the podcast. Welcome, Curtis.
Hello, Becky. How are you doing? You okay?
I'm great, thank you. How are you?
Very good, thank you. Very good. And thanks for inviting me on the podcast.
Oh, you're very welcome. You're very welcome. And our listeners might not be aware of, just exactly what SGS do. Curtis, would you give us a bit of an overview of what your company actually does?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So SGS, we are, our official slogan is that we're the world leading certification, inspection, testing and verification company.
Okay.
And what that essentially means is that the business line that I work in specifically is ISO certification. So management systems basically. So myself, my role is the sales executive. So I work with new clients who are looking to attain ISO certification, so management system certification, and also existing clients that we work with who may need an extension to scope or maybe a new standard. When I say standard, that is the ISO certification. So for example, the topic of today is sustainability. Yep. So there's various standards surrounding ISO, various standards surrounding sustainability, such as ISO 14001, which is environmental management systems. But yeah, there's an awful lot of array of different standards for management systems. But of course, there is also different areas of businesses, different areas that we can help companies with for their various needs as well within different areas.
Amazing. And thanks for explaining that, Curtis. So the world's biggest independent testing and verification certification body, pretty big then. And for our listeners, we have other podcasts in the series on ISO systems. It's almost like the cherry on top of the cake, isn't it? Going for certification and having, an independent body or an independent audit from an organization such as yourselves. And can you just define for our listeners, what do you actually mean by certification? Is there a nice way of summing that up effectively?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we talk about certification, what that means is, and you actually said it yourself, Becky, that we are the third party certification body. So we're independent from any other organization. And our role is to come in and audit a company or your organization against the requirements of a specific ISO. So when we're talking about certification, what that means is that we will come in and audit you against a certain criteria. And as long as you meet that criteria and you pass the criteria, you would then be certified against the standard that you have been audited against.
Okay. And this might sound an obvious question, but I'm sure our listeners would be interested to know, in terms of the benefit and the added value of being certified to a management system as opposed to not being certified. Is there a nice way of kind of capturing that benefit, Curtis, or is it too hard to explain?
No, not at all. Absolutely. It depends on really what you define as value within your organization. Now, the most common way that people determine value from a certification point of view within a company is what's going to be the return for me getting this ISO, let's say environmental management system, so ISO 14001. One of the main reasons that companies and organizations typically go down the route of certification is because they have been asked for it on a tender, for example. So we're seeing that more and more, and more companies, especially in this day and age where sustainability, of course, is a very hot topic. Companies are now wanting to work with other organizations within their supply chain who have a commitment to the environment, a commitment to sustainability, and obviously a commitment to improving the world we live in, essentially. So really the value that you can get just from a top level perspective, if you look at it from a business perspective, would purely be that you open up new doors to actually gain new business because you're actually certified.
Fantastic. So for our listeners, lots of lovely benefits and lots of added value coming forward for that certification process. And Curtis, I mean, this might be, the $100 million question, but how much does it cost to go through certification? Is there a sort of defined answer to that, or is it a variable? What sort of costs are involved?
Yeah, no, that's fine. It isn't a fixed value. So the cost ultimately that just depends on the size of your organization. So one of the the easiest way within, from an ISO perspective to determine how much audit time is needed on site at least a starting point would be how many employees does this company have in their organization? Because naturally the higher amount of employees that you have, that could potentially dictate that you would need to have more audit time against a certain standard. Now, in terms of how much it costs, there's also variables including depending on what you do. So naturally, if you work in an office environment, for example, that's a low risk environment, and it won't take as long to audit than if we were going to a manufacturing site, for example. So all these are taken into consideration when we determine how much it costs to be certified. If we, for example, have, let's say, a small organization listening to this podcast today, maybe less than 10 people, then typically what you'd expect would be an audit varying from 2 to 3 days for an initial audit, and then subsequently for the annual audits, 1 day annually. However, of course, that does just depend on a number of different factors, but that's just to give people a guideline. And then finally, just in terms of cost, we work off a day rate. So we have an at least for SGS, we do have an all-inclusive day rate. And that day rate incorporates everything from travel for the auditor, management fee of your contract, etc., etc.
Yeah. So they could get a indicative budget by contacting you for a quote. You would put that day rate into the quote, and then they can sort of plan the budgets around those costs. And just for clarity as well for our listeners, the certification cycle, it's not a one-off, is it, Curtis? There's like it's like a clock. You come back round again, don't you?
Yes, you can't get rid of us, I'm afraid. No, I'm joking. So we do work off, ISO certification works off a 3-year cycle. And basically how that works is that the first year when we would come in and audit yourselves, it's actually split up into 2 parts. So you'd have a stage 1 and then a stage 2. Now, the stage 1, that is what we call a preparedness review. So if you can just imagine us sitting like we're doing now almost, because a lot of audits are still being conducted remotely, the auditor would sit down with yourselves either in an office or remotely for the stage 1 and just go through your management system and make sure that you're sufficiently prepared for the stage 2, which is the on-site assessment, basically. Now, the stage 2 that's where the auditor would do a physical audit of your processes and your procedures, just to make sure that you're complying to the standard. And that's the first year. And then in subsequent years, as you said, Becky, we do come once a year after that, just to make sure that you're still conforming to the standard and you've still got processes and procedures in place. And it's really for your benefit, just to make sure that you're still doing what you say you're doing depending on which standard that you're certified to.
Yeah, absolutely. So the audit body will come back round, like you say, once a year, or in some cases you might opt for twice a year. I've heard companies have 6 monthlies. Is that still a thing, Curtis? Or
Yes, it's still a thing. We have found that a lot of companies now they do prefer to have annual visits. However, that's just from an SGS perspective, of course. You can actually have 6 monthly audits if you wish. We do have companies or organizations that we work with that have 6 monthly audits because they prefer to be kept on their toes on a more frequent basis.
I
So
see.
each to their own.
And like you say, it's a 3-year cycle, isn't it, for
Yes.
certification? So does the clock effectively start again year 4? And you'd have to budget for the next 3-year cycle. Is that correct? Or
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. So how it would work, would you have your initial audit year one, and then
Mm.
you'd have a surveillance visit. We call them a surveillance visit in year two and then year three. And then when you get to year four, we would do something called a recertification, which is essentially a slightly longer audit, but it just the reason why it's slightly longer is that we go through the whole management system again just to make sure that you're conforming to the standard.
Amazing. Oh, thank you so much. I think that's incredibly clear. And also, you've kind of touched on my next question, which was about around timescales for the process. But one of the things I think we could just briefly touch on is, the application process as well, Curtis. If there's someone out there that's thinking about, achieving an ISO for sustainability, and wants to contact yourselves, how long does it typically take, from filling out the original application form to get into that stage one audit, if you like?
Yeah, so it's a question that I get asked quite a lot, to be fair. And the time scales does vary from organization to organization. So if you, for example, already, let's just go from the very start. So you have no management system in place. You've just heard of ISO, but you do need to attain it or do need to achieve it because it's come up on a tender, for example. So we'll go off that basis. Once you've made an initial inquiry with ourselves, and then I would send a quotation out pretty much straight away within the next 24 to 48 hours or even less in most circumstances. After that point, if you're happy to go ahead with it, then you sign the proposal. And in between the signing of the proposal and actually having a stage one, that is your opportunity to start implementing the standard, essentially, or implementing the system, sorry. Um, how long that will take will depend on the resources that you have available, how urgent it is in terms of how high up your priority list it is. But I'd probably say average would maybe be 3 to 6 months to get from nothing to a stage one, and then from a stage one to a stage two, typically it's max, I'd say another 3 months. So we have seen organizations that have come to ourselves from scratch and actually got certification within 6 months. But there's also, I'd say it's probably more reasonable to say that 9 months to a year would be feasible depending on the size of your organization, really.
That's a fantastic answer. I'm sure our listeners will really appreciate that, Curtis. Thank you so much. And while we're on the subject of certification, I think we do need to demystify the difference between accreditation and certification, because a lot of people do get these two things mixed up. And I don't know if you'd like to just explain, what is the role of the accreditation body, which in the UK is UKAS, as opposed to certification bodies?
Yeah, it is a common misconception, but it's one that's easily missed. Certainly, when I started with the business, it took me a while to get my head around it as well. But basically, the SGS, we are a certification body. Now, there are certification bodies which are UKAS accredited, and there's also certification bodies which are non-UKAS accredited. So so it's actually UKAS's role to determine who they deem acceptable to be an accredited certification body. So their role essentially is to audit ourselves, and it's basically to make sure that we are conducting a competent audit, and it's to make sure that we're actually doing what we're meant to be doing whilst we're on site as well. Um, I mean, there's so many different benefits of having a UKAS certification body, but I think probably one of the most important things that I see is that it does significantly reduce the risk to yourselves and the organization that you're with. So if we just very briefly use an example of health and safety, for example, ISO 45001, health and safety certification. If you're using a UKAS certification body, one of the requirements is that an auditor, well, for any standard that you're audited against, one of the requirements is that you have to have a competent auditor sent to your site, and an auditor which is competent within your industry. Now, once you have an auditor on site who knows what they're meant to be looking at, they know the risks that are present as well, and then they're going to actually be carrying out a competent audit. You can see then that they may well find things that you may have missed, but they're also going to find things that potentially are non-UKAS certification body would have missed as well, because that auditor that they send may not actually be competent within that industry.
Yeah, yeah.
And the same actually goes for sustainability as well. If you haven't got an auditor who is competent within the industry of within the realm of sustainability, then as you can imagine, that means then that the certificate that you get will not actually have as much value.
Sure. So it links really to reputation risk management, doesn't it, Curtis? Having that UKAS badge, if you like, on the certificate
Yeah.
for the certification body. And you know, a lot of investors now, ESG investors, socially responsible investment, are looking for these, aren't they? That's become sort of like a hot potato item, isn't it, to have, you know, accredited certification body management systems. Mm.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one of the things, whilst we've gone back to shareholders and investors, that actually brings me round quite nicely to the other benefits and the value that certification can bring. Because when you actually attain certification, apart from the fact that you'll then open up doors from tenders, it also will significantly increase the confidence that shareholders and investors have in the organization, because they can see that not only have you've demonstrated that you've got a commitment to the environment. If we use environmental management systems, for example, it also means that you're certified by a UKAS accredited body such as ourselves.
Absolutely fantastic. So thanks, Curtis, so much. You know, we've covered such a lot of ground there. Everything from, you know, what is a certification body, you know, what are the costs involved, what are the timescales. You know, we've looked at the expertise, like you say, the competency of the auditors that you get via SGS, and looked really at, you know, the credibility that's available through using, you know, a UKAS accredited certification body. Is there anything else that you'd like to add, Curtis, you know, while we've got you on the podcast, around the value on and the benefits of certification? Is there anything we might have missed, do you think? Or
Yes, actually, absolutely. One of the things I also wanted to touch on was just in terms of compliance and legal compliance, because when you go for, again, because we're on the theme of sustainability, if we use ISO 14001 environmental management systems as an example, one of the requirements within that standard is for the auditor, for the company to keep up to date with the legislative requirements and also the compliance related to the environment. And we would come in and check those. So it basically makes sure that you as an organization, you're being legally compliant. And that's obviously a massive benefit in itself, because that means that you'll then have to have someone who's regularly checking up on it, and then making sure that everything's up to date as well. Because at the end of the day, environmental management systems, and in fact other ISO systems as well, they can reduce the risk for you to get fines or insurance costs, or you know, anything from you know, going to court, you know, even as well. So there is certainly that benefit.
And that's a good point. Yeah, thanks. Thank you. I think our listeners will really feel the benefit of that. Thanks. Yeah. Any other points there that you want to add, Curtis, on the value?
But the last thing that I'll touch on would just be in terms of the people, within the organization. So very much about changing people's behavior and changing the culture within an organization as well, because that can be typically one of the biggest roadblocks I see when organizations start to implement a management system, is just changing that culture and changing that behavior. But once that starts to gradually change, not only will it mean on the high level that there's going to be potential cost savings in terms of streamlining processes and procedures, it also just means that there's going to be a safer working environment, and also perhaps a more sustainable working environment, depending again on the ISO that you go for.
Absolutely. No, that's amazing. Thank you, Curtis, for explaining again culture change, you know, and the value that can bring, behavior change, and also, like you say, compliance. So the kind of classic governance, risk, compliance triangle, isn't it? You know, the ISOs can add a lot of benefit on those touch points. But having somebody like yourselves from SGS come in and do the independent certification audit and that process, like you say, it's a 3-year cycle, which great that you explain that for our listeners. And that, you know, if you want to add ISOs to your collection, if we call it that, I'm sure you're able to offer. I mean, do you want to touch on that? Do SGS offer different ISO auditors for different ISOs, or do you tend to get a one-stop shop approach? How does that work on multiple certifications?
So auditor wise, we tend to have auditors, what we call IMS auditors, which all that means is integrated management system auditors. So most of our auditors can do more than one standard. So some listeners may actually be familiar with quality management systems, so ISO 9001. Typically, what I see organizations doing nowadays is that they go for maybe 2 or 3 additional standards on top of that. So we can actually have auditors come in and do a management system audit against 2, 3 standards, 4, 5 standards. It does very much depend on the auditor. The standard nowadays is that an auditor can do 2 or 3 ISO management system audits. But even if you wanted to go for multiple standards within the organization for whatever needs, we do have, typically what would happen is that you have an audit team that would be present on site, and then they can distribute it accordingly, essentially.
Perfect. So SGS can help our listeners. If you do have more than one ISO management system that you're looking for certification for, you could, effectively buy one, get one free in terms of the auditor with their knowledge, skills and competency that they can bring to the table. But also that could potentially reduce some of the costs, couldn't it, Curtis, if you're sending one person rather than 2 people, I guess?
Yes, it does. So how that works is that when you integrate your management systems, naturally they follow a structure. They all follow a very similar structure. So Annex SL, and you'll see that if you do purchase a copy of the standard, one of the things you'll see is Annex SL structure, and it's just the contents of the actual standard itself. Now these standards, all of the core standards, and the core being 9001, 14001, 45001, for example, they all follow the same structure. And the auditor, because they're multi-standard auditor, it means that they'll be able to look at the core elements at the same time, even though they're for different standards. And obviously what that means is that they're not duplicating the work, and it's going to save us time from an audit perspective, but also it's going to save the company or the organization time and cost as well, because it's reduced the amount of time on the site.
That's such a good explanation. Thank you again, Curtis, for that insight into IMS, Integrated Management Systems. And again, for sustainability, this is going to become much more popular, I'm sure, amongst our listeners on Sustainability Street. So I'd just like to thank Curtis Thornton again from SGS, Sales Executive. The link to the SGS website will be on podcast notes as well, if you want to take a look at the website, for coming along today and explaining what do we mean by certification, what's the value it can add, how long does it take to achieve, what's the costs, and some of the more sort of intangible things around reputation, risk, benefits, culture change, which has been so interesting. Thank you again, Curtis, for being our special guest on Sustainability Street podcast.
Thank you very much, Becky. It's a pleasure being on here.
You're very welcome. And we'll make sure, obviously, your contact details, your email, go into our podcast notes description. So if any of our listeners are considering going for a certified management system for sustainability, the various ISOs that we've chatted about today, please feel free to get in touch with Curtis via his email address. Please also follow us on socials at Crowbury Consulting and Crowbury Energy on Twitter, LinkedIn, and also Instagram. And we hope that you'll be joining us again soon, listeners, for another podcast. If you've enjoyed this one, please leave us a good review and a thumbs up. And we look forward to catching up with you all next time on Sustainability Street.